As the topic suggests, this will be undoubtedly a very interesting and profoundly contentious issue, unraveling the South African economy, its challenges, opportunities, and threats to bring about what we all wish for, a better life for all. As I've been, but today, I'm having a group of distinguished panelists and respondents who I believe are up to the task of getting into the finer details, dissecting the South African economy. First, we have Comrade Enoch Godongwane, a member of the National Executive Committee of the ANC and the chair of the Economic Transformation Committee. He is also the chairperson of the Development Bank of Southern Africa and previously served as the General Secretary of the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa. He also served as the MEC for Economic Development in the Eastern Cape, as well as Deputy Minister of Public Enterprises and Economic Development. This is the person that we're going to be having today. And secondly, we are having Dr. Neva Makgetla, who is also a member of the National Executive Committee and a senior economist at Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies TIPS. She has worked very closely in politics and economy in South Africa, previously worked at the presidency. He also was the head of COSATU Policy Unity. She holds a Harvard degree in economics and a PhD in economics from Humboldt University in Berlin. Next is Comrade Nokolo Kivit, who is a member of the National Executive Committee and currently as well a Deputy Minister of Public Works and Infrastructure. She previously served as the Speaker of the Provincial Legislature in the Eastern Cape, as well as the #1 citizen of that province as a Premier of Eastern Cape. As respondents, we have Michael Sachs, the adjunct professor of economics at Wits University, as well as acting chairperson of the Fiscal and Finance Commission. Previously, she worked as the head of the budget office at National Treasury. He also spent about 9 years at Luthuli House, coordinating economic policy and research. He holds an MSc degree in economics from the University of London, as well as a master's in public administration from Harvard School of Government. We have also as a respondent, Comrade Dr. Alex Mashilo, a member of the Central Committee of the South African Communist Party, and also a special advisor to the Premier of Limpopo, Comrade Matabata. He previously worked also as a full-time shop steward at NUMSA. He holds a MA degree on labor policy and globalization from Wits University, as well as a doctorate PhD in sociology from the same University of Wits. He also has a diploma in engineering. And last but not least, we have Ngobilen Zimande, who is currently doing her PhD in economics at Rhodes University. Her PhD is on measuring the intergenerational social mobility in a 21st century South African context. In 2019, Ngobile was listed as a part of South Africa's ABSA Grand Star top 100 students amongst university students in the whole of the Republic of South Africa. She also served as director at Rhodes University's Economic Student Society. So those are the comrades and colleagues that we are having today. To set the scene, I will call upon Comrade Enoch Godongwane to give us setting the scene. I also will request that all the panelists and the respondents to limit themselves to more than 10 minutes so that we can be able to have a lot of discussions from the participants here on Zoom, as well as other media outlets. So without any further ado, Comrade Enoch, the floor is yours.
Comrade Chair, I will definitely limit myself to less than 10 minutes. In setting the scene, I'm going to remind ourselves about what we said in NASLAC and the manifesto and a couple of other developments since then and how they are likely to impact on the resolution of NASLAC. And touch on what has been the response in terms of the recovery plan by the party, and conclude by saying what I think is necessary. So the next slide, I don't know who's handling this thing. On the economic front, you will see we kind of resolve in a menu long list of issues. Among others, top on the list was the land redistribution and restitution, with a key instrument to achieve that objective being expropriation without compensation. Among other things was also the infrastructure and energy security. We're going to come back to that thing because it continues to haunt and constrain growth. Restoring good governance, state-owned companies, that remains our challenge. Ownership of the Reserve Bank, which is also an important challenge. State Bank and some of the discussions about the State Bank as to what is the best way to achieve the similar objective. Closing wage gaps, skills revolution, which you'll see it has taken a center stage in the SONA this year. Strengthening monopoly and competition regulation. And to that effect, the Competition Act has been amended to give effect to that resolution. Illegal outflows and regulation of the financial sector. We've not made significant progress in that regard. Procurement policies and the BE Act, we now have an act of parliament and a bill which is going to parliament to achieve those objectives. The resolving the mining sector regulation, a number of steps have been taken to give effect to that. And state mining company does exist, whether it is achieving the objectives, that's a different question. Improving social justice for poor people and better conditions for workers. And I would imagine that as we discuss, we need to say, where have we gone and what is going to be the major report back as we go to the NGC. And I think Comrade Nakolo and Comrade Nivo will probably go more on those areas. We tried to give effect in the manifesto, which crafted in Durban in 2019, effect to some of the resolutions given the time. I'm not going to go into detail into that. Next slide. A challenge which has met in midstream has been the year of the pandemic. The COVID-19 shock is posing unprecedented challenges. The economic crisis entailed by the pandemic is unique in that it combines health and economic shocks. Deep supply shocks arising from wide range and prolonged lockdowns of the economy by introducing measures such as travel restrictions, quarantines, community lockdowns, and and businesses. Consequently, and also demand shocks arising from a collapse in corporate investment, retrenchment of household spending, and rapidly increasing unemployment. I don't want to go into detail in some of the responses. All of us are familiar with government responses. Next slide. Next, and having said that, there's no doubt South Africa was hit hard by the pandemic at a time when the country was already struggling from economic stagnation, elevated unemployment, weakening infrastructure, and subdued development outcomes. And that, if you look at the figures, we probably throw a slide, look at from 2015 onwards, the picture has not been promising. The effect of that has been lower output, lower capacity to create jobs, high unemployment, lower household finances, and so on. We responded in June last year by developing what was called a reconstruction, growth, transformation, building a new economy. I'll come back to the pillars of it later on. Next slide. And I don't want to what we know by now with the figures that the economy contracted by 7% last year, probably the largest in recorded history. Some people said last thing in 1946. So which deepened the pre-existing socioeconomic trends such as infrastructure gaps, income inequality, and rising unemployment. Next slide. If you compare the impact on GDP and compare the scale of that impact, if you compare that with the global financial crisis, you'll see the global financial crisis was minus 1.5%. At the moment, we're talking at minus 7%. The leaders we've been talking about of a kind of lower economic growth over the years, you'll see that from 2014 onwards, we've been basically, the economy has been performing badly. So the COVID-19 has exacerbated the problem. It's not the only problem. Go on. Of course, we're going to need a stable fiscal position, which is critical. Government expenditure is too high if you compare it with the revenue that we're generating. The perennial problems such as the electricity shortage continue to limit the ability to respond to these challenges. And next slide. Here we just show the consolidated expenditure growth over the MTF. In fact, some sectors such as peace and security will experience a negative growth at a time when there's more crime in this country. So we need to think carefully, how do we discuss these issues? Next slide. Next slide. Skip this one. Here we just show, I'm not going to go into detail, the slide will be circulated. Go back to the slide. Here we're looking at the different taxes, and you'll see that the majority of people who are paying personal income tax was about 5 million. With the pre-COVID was about 7.5. Post-COVID, we're talking probably about 5 million of those people are paying PIT. That has serious implications for the development outcomes. What was the organizing thinking and framework when we drafted our response at the time? It may have been overtaken by events at the moment. When we were crafting the reconstruction document, first was to look at infrastructure program, which served as a basis to ignite economic recovery. I'll come back to the next slide as to why that to us was critical. And the protection of vulnerable groups, and more coordination of the macroeconomic policy instruments to ensure that the sufficient finance and all these policies are sufficiently financed and are financially sustainable. We're hoping and still hope that the African Free Continental Free Trade Agreement will be also part of the drivers moving forward. A key issue which I think we need to delve it. I mean, have a better discussion is Black economic empowerment. There's been, and whether we like it or not, a reversal of the gains we've made before 2008. Since 2009, we've seen a reversal of those gains. We need to be thinking slightly. But a key instrument is going to be a capable state. Next slide. Next slide. Are we still having the person? Next slide. I don't have a slide. Let me see what I can do in the meantime. In the meantime, I'll continue talking of the cuff. So the key pillars of that program was localization, transformation, industrialization, investment in the second economy, job creation, and small businesses, and some sectoral interventions. But why we were talking about the infrastructure spending and what kind of infrastructure we're beginning to prioritize in the discussion, I'm not sure whether we're on the same page with government. What we're saying in that discussion, the virus has revealed some of the shortcomings in our developmental trajectory, in the sense that you required people to wash hands, you required people to do social distance in an environment when those things were not practical in some of our communities. And the reason was lack of investment in that infrastructure, which is useful. That's why we call that the correcting the legacy of underdevelopment. And therefore, you will recall that in the RDP, one of the things we're suggesting in the RDP was what we called a basic needs, in a sense, where we're investing in these communities, but stimulating growth at the same time. Next slide. Go to the slide with immediate interventions and go to the slide with immediate interventions. What were the immediate interventions proposed in our document? First was the creation of decent work, which we said remains the most powerful way to address the problem of income inequality and poverty. The capacity of the economy to create employment faster than growth rate of the labor force depends on economic growth and skills and efficiency of the labor market. All these factors require a coherent and multifaceted combination of growth-oriented policies shifts that include microeconomic reforms, trade industrial policy, macroeconomic reforms, public works, social policy, skills, and development measure. Specifically, we then said South Africa needs a job creation schemes. Now, we're distinguishing between the long-term job creation and the short-term measures. And we're then saying as short-term measures, there are couple of things that need to be done. First, in public employment programs, which are in that sense, we're talking about what COSAT used to say as an employer of last resort. In that sense, we're saying use short-term employment, public employment programs, and in the process link that with skills development as a short-term measure while we're making a strategic intervention on the growth area. Second to that is that parallel focus must be given to what we call labor absorbing industrial programs. In that sense, we then had to, as part of the construction, focus on labor-based construction methods. Skills was a critical area which we said must be given a top on the list. Next. I'm not want to deal, given the time constraints. These are the issues we're talking about. Key here was how do we make sure that the financial sector is drawn into the infrastructure expansion? And among the discussions people were raising is the issue of Regulation 28. And next slide. No, I don't want to deal with that. I've dealt with, it's largely a sequencing issue there, infrastructure in the meantime, pull jobs along the same line. Next. One of the things we need to, you'll go into any conference resolution, we talk about state capacity in all conferences. It's a matter which we believe that is elusive, which needs to be discussed in detail. Why can't we, even where resources are available, we tend to focus on the resource allocation, but even where resources are available, our capacity to deliver becomes a challenge, which
maybe Comrade Enoch, if you can wind up.
Okay, I'm winding up, Comrade Chair. Next slide. The current circumstances require elevated government interventions for many years. It's not going to be an easy task. This is in order to absorb the huge pool of unemployment, increase GDP performance, and raising standard of living. I'm not sure, that's my having said all of that, I'm not sure that the current pace of fiscal consolidation will not, I think there's a misprint here. I'm not sure whether the current pace of fiscal consolidation will not undermine these objectives I'm talking about. I'm not sure whether I'm impressed by saying in a couple of years we'll be celebrating a budget surplus. So in a sense, I'm saying the fiscal framework sometimes in a small way needs to consider some of the challenges above. Thank you, Comrade Chair.
Thank you, Comrade Enoch, for setting the scene. I think now we can move to the next panelist, Comrade Dr. Niva Makgetla. Having listened to the setting of the scene by Comrade Enoch Godongwane, maybe you may want to, amongst other things, Comrade Niva, to dwell on what kind of approaches might be taken by the ANC and its alliance in order to ensure that we have this effective turnaround of the economy. You have the floor.
Okay, do I have the screen though? Because I thought I'd be able to put it up myself. Shanaz?
Obakeng, can you put the slides for Comrade Niva?
I don't think Obakeng has the slides that I wanted to use.
Go ahead. You could go ahead.
Is it set up to share? Okay, thank you. Excellent. If I can find the... No, of course I'm not seeing it. Just a sec. Sorry, it's not showing up there for some reason. Apologies, Comrade Jeff. Okay, can you see, no?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, so as you said, I wanted to talk about, I don't know why it says December, it should say March 21, I didn't change the date. So I wanted to talk about reconstruction and recovery. I'm not going to go in detail through the discussion document, since I assume, of course, everybody has looked at it. What I will do is go briefly over the economic challenge, although Comrade Enoch has already done that. Talk about some of the key debates. Talk about why we are where we are, in the sense of we inherited a deeply inequitable and unjust economy, and we haven't changed it as much as I think we all thought we would have 25 years later. What are some of the key debates on reconstruction now that we're faced with the COVID crisis. And then I was going to raise some points just to get discussion going, Comrade Jeff. Okay. So, I mean, this just really recapitulates what Enoch said, that if we look at the core economic challenges we face, we are both amongst the most unequal countries in the world, and we have some of the slowest growth. So what you can see from the chart is that we have accepted the height of the commodity boom when our export prices were very high, lasted from around 2002 to around 2011. And really, we only reached the NDP target for GDP growth at that point, at the height of the commodity boom. And except for that, we've generally been far below it. And if you look at the line with the little blocks, that's the growth in employment creation, which the NDP sets a target of 3%. And again, we're very far below that. And in fact, we have been getting worse. And this little line here, this is what COVID did, because we saw an 8% decline in employment over 2020 as a whole and a 7% decline in the GDP, which more or less knocked us back to the early 2000s in terms of the size of the GDP. So where you can see we're particularly unusual, 40% of working age adults are employed. Everywhere else in the world, it's 60%. So we're very far behind unemployment. We also have unusually unequal workplaces and pay. So if you look at the pay scale within enterprises and between industries, it's much more unequal than is normal in the rest of the world. There are very big disparities in ownership of assets. That includes ownership of small business, but also financial assets, also housing, also land. We have made progress by race in the sense that the richest 10%, however you measure it, is increasingly representative. In fact, it's now majority Black. But of course, that's still far short of equality. And poorer deciles are almost entirely Black. So you have a situation where the richest decile is no longer exclusively white, but the other deciles are all Black. And if we look at it also in spatial terms, in terms of the way apartheid shaped this, where people live, the historic labor-sending regions, that's HLS stands for Historic Labor-Sending Regions, which they used to call so-called homelands, they're still far behind the rest of the economy in terms of employment and income. In fact, if we were to take those areas out of the country, South Africa would look much more like other middle-income countries in terms of joblessness, inequality, and growth. And of course, like I said, since the end of the commodity boom, growth has slowed, and employment growth has slowed with it. And then you get to what I'm calling a depression from COVID-19. But it should be said, this is the average for all of 2020. But in fact, there was quite a strong recovery from the second quarter in both employment and even more in GDP. But that recovery depends a lot on the fact that our export prices for gold, platinum, and iron ore have all been very high, partially for speculative reasons, partially because of the recovery in China. But we also have to control COVID nationally and globally, and we have to hope that our main trading partners also control COVID and also keep growing. The question is, why is it that, as Comrade Enoch and I are saying, we've made some progress on growth, we've made very little progress on job creation, and not much progress, although some, on inequality. And I want to talk about it in terms of what generated this situation before '94, and then why has this situation persisted? Firstly, in terms of what the production of the system, basically, as we all know, apartheid tried to set up a cheap labor system. To do that, it basically destroyed people's alternative livelihoods and imposed residential restrictions so as to compel the majority to work as wage labor, especially on the mines and farms. But also they limited education in order to ensure that the privileged people who had an education would be able to earn more money. So in effect, you have a set of institutions from the schools, but also including, for instance, professional associations and immigration rules that were designed to limit the number. So as to, this thing now says I'm muted. Was that intentional? Sorry, it said I was muted. Was I muted? Or was that just? Oh dear.
We could hear you correctly, Eva.
Sorry, I got a sign saying that I was muted, so I kind of panicked a little bit. Sorry. Okay, so basically, yeah, you have limited education in order to ensure that skilled jobs are paid much higher. That's one of the reasons our wages system is so unequal. But then what happened was, after you set up a system to generate cheap labor, the mines and the farms in particular started to shed labor through the 1980s. So effectively, the people who would have been employed on the mines and farms are now unemployed. The other thing that helped generate this deeply unequal system was that there was strong support for the mining value chain through the provision of infrastructure, especially railroads and electricity and water, through a supportive legal framework, through taxation laws, and so on. And the aim was to grow exports and profits and generate more employment, particularly for the privileged group. But the problem is the mining value chain doesn't create that many jobs, and it tends to limit the scope for emerging business. And also the systems were set up so that the big mining companies could largely capture the rents rather than them being used to develop the economy as a whole or for social purposes. Other manufacturing also had a considerable degree of protection from tariffs, but even more from the fact in the 1980s that the economy was increasingly isolated. So after 94, obviously the legal systems that maintain this project of inequality was basically ended with the transition to democracy. So the question is, why has it persisted? Why has it reproduced? And what we kind of argue in the paper is, firstly, education remains highly unequal, and so do residential spaces. So a third of the population still lives in the historic labor-sending regions where they're very far from economic opportunities, and there's unusually high joblessness. There's limited and disjointed support for small and micro enterprise, so there hasn't been an equalization of productive assets. That includes relatively limited land reform. Infrastructure provision has been very extensive, but the quality is often poor and the price is now getting quite expensive. Financing for SMEs is very limited. So all of the Small Enterprise Financial Agency has about R1 billion. For comparison, the IDC has 15 billion. And then we've done it particularly little to assist SMEs to get into market chains, to get access to markets, whether into value chains or to consumer markets and so on. In terms of our industrial policy, we have been unable to promote substantial diversification into more labor-intensive manufacturing or value-adding services. So a particular problem of the mining value chain is there is a lot of manufacturing associated with it, but it's essentially downstream beneficiation. So obviously the metals refineries, but also coal refineries, which is Eskom and Sasol, both effectively refine coal into other products. And there's upstream as capital goods. And those things have grown and they're quite competitive, but they don't create a lot of jobs. In contrast, in East Asia, where industrialization has been associated with more equitable outcomes, they started with clothing and appliances and electronics, which are very labor intensive and created jobs on a mass scale. And that meant that the industrialization project also had more support, but it also meant that it actually contributed to a more equitable as well as a more dynamic economy. And then finally, we have continued support for the mining value chain, particularly through Transnet, which provides cheap transport for iron ore and coal in particular, and through Eskom, which provides cheap electricity, especially for the aluminum refineries, but to some extent for the other refineries, and as well as the regulatory and tax systems that we haven't shifted very much. So just so you can see what we mean when we say, you know, the way apartheid left a somewhat different economy. I mean, what you can see here is this. In these are economies, other upper middle income countries are more or less the same income and GDP per capita as South Africa. And really, when you look at it from an employment standpoint, two big differences stand out. Firstly, we have many more people. This red line is the share of the working age population that actually owns a business or is self-employed or an employer. And you can see it's much lower than in other upper middle income countries, but our unemployment level is much higher. And that's directly linked to the fact that we don't really have a class of small business, especially in agriculture. And so if you look at employment in agriculture, in South Africa, only 6% of the population is in agriculture. In other upper middle income countries, it's 16%. And those two facts together explain not all of the jobless problem in South Africa, but quite a lot of it. And that's all directly linked to the way apartheid destroyed small business, and especially small agriculture. And we haven't found a way to compensate for that. And it doesn't mean we can simply say to everybody, go back and be a small farmer, you understand. It just says that is a structural problem that we haven't managed to fix. A second problem, when you look at the way our manufacturing, this is a way of understanding how we compare to other upper middle income countries. I've excluded China just because they're so big, they dominate everybody else. What's interesting is that if you can see that if you look at how things compare as a share of exports for South Africa as a ratio to the share of other upper middle income countries, of course, we're quite high when it comes to mining products. We'd expect that. And we're not as high as others when it comes to food, but we're not that far behind. And oddly enough, in manufacturing, in fact, we look very competitive compared to other countries in the sense that we have virtually the same share of our exports as manufactured as other countries. The difference is what we export. So we export a lot of assembled autos. So our auto industry is relatively small. It's essentially an assembly industry. It has relatively limited domestic inputs, but it's highly competitive internationally. So we export many more cars relative to our total exports to most other countries. Same thing for chemicals, but that's really part of the mining value chain because most of this is Sasol and it's based on coal. So it's really exporting refined coal. Capital goods, we also look, okay, most of this is mining equipment for neighboring countries that is disproportionately sold in neighboring countries. But we still continue to supply the region very largely with capital goods. But when it comes to clothing and textiles and electronics and electronic appliances, which is where they started with manufacturing in Asia 40 years ago, or more than 40 years ago, more like 60 or 70 years ago, you know, those things create a lot of jobs. And that meant that when they industrialized, they automatically maintained employment and created a more equitable economy. Whereas we can grow our auto industry. In fact, it's one of our 5 largest exports, but it only employs 100,000 people out of an economy with 15 million people employed. You could grow that auto industry quite a lot and not actually make a dent on unemployment because it just doesn't employ enough people directly. Sorry, now it's not going down. This is not my day for technology. Sorry, I'm going to just stop sharing and try. Apologies, guys. It for some reason decided to stick. Ugh.
So how many slides left?
No, not that many. So this is just a slide on small business. We can share that. When we talk about reconstruction, sorry, 2 more slides, Camera Jeff. When we talk about reconstruction, what really is noticeable is everybody's happy to say there are structural constraints. But what we never quite manage to point out is that we disagree profoundly about what the structural constraints are. So business will say the main structural constraints are infrastructure and red tape, and especially electricity and rail. And the way they want to solve that primarily is to allow private suppliers so that you get they argue cheaper and more efficient supply. But they also say there are problems with regulations. They're not often very specific about what the problems are with the regulations, but it seems like their priorities are in employment relations, dismissals for productivity and for discipline, visas for skilled workers and tourists, the broad-based BEE requirements and the certification requirements if you want to sell to government, and generally a whole range of licenses to operate. At the national level, you've got water, you've got environmental requirements, and you've got mining licenses amongst others. And then again, at the municipal level, there's also a whole range of municipal requirements, also around health and safety, and just generally around needing and zoning and all of those kinds of things. A second approach to these structural constraints comes out of industrial policy, and it says what we need to do is promote manufacturing because they think that's the best way to grow the economy. Part of the problem with this analysis is it doesn't, again, say what are the structural challenges besides electricity. Everybody agrees on electricity, I should say, that we need to fix the electricity system. But besides that, you know, there are debates about, for instance, if we want to grow manufacturing, how do we see the mining value chain in that context? Should it be a source of inputs for more advanced manufacturing, so we go from iron ore to steel to auto industry? Should we rather see it as a way to develop our capital goods industry? Or should we just say, look, they generate rents, we should use those rents to invest in other industries that are more labor intensive? I think whichever those views you take, everybody agrees we need to capture the rents to finance manufacturing, whether we do it through taxation or through pricing. So for instance, one of the problems with Eskom is that Eskom used to keep the electricity price low by capturing the rents from coal. What's happened in the last 10 years is that the price of coal for domestic use has begun to approach the price internationally, and that reduces Eskom's competitiveness. I mean, there are obviously other problems with Eskom, but that's one of them. We'd also have to redirect our investment in infrastructure to support new kinds of productive activity and not just mining. So we've had, during the commodity boom, when we had a very big infrastructure program, a lot of it ended up, both Eskom and Transnet in particular, ended up supporting expansion in mining and not diversification. And really possibly the biggest thing is for the state to change the structure of production means it has to take risks and it can fail. And it's been very difficult for us to take those risks, to decide we're going to put enough resources into something that might fail to actually make a difference.
Comrade Neva, if you can wind up.
Okay, so the third one is just to say we need to address inequality more explicitly through education, more equitable access to assets, workplace inequalities, improving the whole set of support systems for small business identification. So I just have some questions that I think we need to reflect on. One of the main ones is, should the ANC, when it comes to the economy, should we articulate policies that look like government policies, or should we articulate policies that will set clear priorities for government? Because we've tended to write our economic policies as if we were government. Is that appropriate or not? In that context, what should our priorities be for reconstruction? Once we have priorities and clear policies, and this is something Enoch raised, how should we manage business and government in order to pursue those priorities more consistently? And finally, just a question. What do we see as the difference between radical economic transformation and left-wing populism? Thank you, Comrade Chair. Sorry I took too long.
Thanks, Comrade Neva, for those articulation of what debates can be gone into. Now we're moving towards Comrade Nokolo Kivit, who amongst others will focus on how we implement all these policies that have been churning out over the years. As a person who is in the coal face, as a Deputy Minister of Public Works and Infrastructure.
You wanna listen? Listen.
Comrade Nokolo.
Thank you, Chair. And a good evening to all the comrades, to yourself, Chairperson, the leadership online. A good evening to all participants and my fellow comrades who are on the panel. And Chair, allow me to start by reflecting briefly in a minute on the global economic growth trends. I would want to agree with both Comrade Neva and Comrade Enoch on the impact of COVID-19. Because it has affected the whole world. The global economy is estimated that it will grow by 5.5% this year and by 4.2% in 2022. And the advanced economies will grow by 4.3% in 2021 and by 3.1% in 2022. And these include the US, Japan, EU, and UK. Now, all these economies were affected negatively by COVID, as well as ourselves, the emerging and developing economies. It is estimated that they will grow at 6.3% in 2021 and 5% in 2022. But it is worth noting, Chair, that India's economy is projected to achieve 11.5% in 2021 and 6.8% in 2022, whilst China is estimated to grow at 8.1 and 5.6 respectively. Now, sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria is estimated it will grow at 1.5 this year and 2.5 next year. South Africa, we are estimated that will grow by 3.3% in 2021 and 2.2 in 2022. I'm raising this, Chair, against the backdrop of the fact that we dropped, our economy dropped drastically during the growth dropped drastically during the last financial year and the current year, which talks to a low base of 7.2% decline. Now, if we are at that point and we are estimated that it will grow at 3.3, which means we will grow by even less than half of our level of drop. So, which means we will still remain at the bottom of the ladder. I'm raising this so that as we discuss, we move from a premise that understands that if we don't change the way we do things, we are heading for disaster. The reality is that achieving domestic economic recovery will be challenging and will continue to lag behind in terms of global recovery. COVID-19, Chair, exposed and exacerbated our collective poor management of our economy and the marginal outcomes we've achieved. We must always be reminded that the ANC government peruses two policy levers, which is a progressive and sustainable fiscal policy, as well as the measured monetary policy that works towards a sustainable inflation. And we agreed at some point that we need to balance these with the industrial policy. We need to quickly implement the agreed structural reforms required to unlock inclusive economic growth for our country. On the main, the areas that we agreed upon, with the first one being electricity. And with Eskom, who is our main supplier of energy in the form of electricity. Currently, at the state at which it is, we need to ensure that embedded generation regulation will be eased within 3 months. The emergency power procurement bids, as well as procurement of additional power in line with the IRP 2019, will be announced in the coming weeks. Electricity regulations were amended to enable municipalities to procure power from IPPs Divisional managers and boards of directors have been appointed to support the restructuring at Eskom. And therefore, I'm highlighting that without a stable energy source as a country, how it doesn't matter how hard we try on the fronts that we normally talk about industrialization, localization, all those efforts will go to nil if our power supply is as erratic as it is now. Currently, as we speak, we're struggling with load shedding. There's a need, therefore, to create employment. And I can say that by the end of 2021, January, over 430,000 jobs of varying duration have been supported through the stimulus, and additional 180,000 in recruitment. Some of these jobs are the ones that are assisting us in the social services sector. Chair, we need, in terms of supporting our industrial growth, we need to ensure that investments, which have already been made actually in the production of poultry, 800 million there, in clothing, textiles, footwear, and leather, about 500 million investment there, and in the automotive sector, about 16 billion. Those efforts must be enhanced and supported as much as we can. They're currently taking place. You would remember how Comrade EP passionately reports about those efforts to ensure that there's a creation of jobs. On the front of the infrastructure rollout, the infrastructure investment project pipeline worth 340 billion in the network industries such as energy, water, transport, telecommunication has been developed. The blended finance infrastructure fund, as we speak, Chair, is preparing investment in student accommodation or housing, in digital communications, in water, and in sanitation. If you go across our country, you will find quite a number of projects on the ground, and some being planned to drive the network, because the networks, the infrastructure network, is the catalyst to investment and thereby job creation. One would understand that the presidency, working with National Treasury, have what is led by Comrade David Masondo, the Deputy Minister of Finance. He's leading the joint initiative between those two, and the intention there is to fast track the procurement of additional electricity, improving municipal distribution, reducing the administrative burden for embedded generation. It is to ensure that households using analog television switch to digital signals by March 2022. That is next year, so that there's sufficient spectrum to meet demand. We finalize
the one that has been held in abeyance now with the court action.
Hey, those are the troubles I was saying to you earlier when we were discussing.
No, I'm not detracting you. I was just making a passing comment.
I was saying we're working in that environment where you're trying to drive this way, and there are court actions that derail us. But we must still keep focus and do our best to drive these programs. We're expanding the electronic visa system and waivers to support tourism. We are reviewing the regulatory framework and processes that make it difficult to import scarce skills including finalizing critical skills list. We're finalizing the draft white paper on national rail policy to improve freight and commuter rail services. Nyambona Comrade Umrabulo very hard at work. Corporatizing the national ports authority, and taking other measures to increase efficiency and competitiveness of our ports. Reviving the green drop and blue drop programs to strengthen water quality monitoring. Our Department of Environmental Affairs is hard at work there, Chair, to try and push through those programs.
Maybe
I have
you can start winding up, Comrade Noxolo.
Yes, Chair, I have not written land on this because the land redistribution program, we have upped our game in that a lot of land is being unlocked and is being released to communities, to the Department of Human Settlement, for ensuring that we build communities closer to where they work. And therefore that prime land, what would have been called prime land, with the program to release that land and ensure also that the drive for ownership of land is upheld. Comrade Enoch spoke on the fiscal challenge. Let me skip it because you said I must round up, but we really have to ensure that the efforts to reduce growth in the public sector wage bill must remain on course. And with the labor appeal of South Africa confirming the question of, for me, the balance on affordability and sustainability, those two must balance in this respect. There's significant risks remain. The global outlook is highly uncertain, with economic recovery largely dependent on the response to COVID-19. Several state-owned companies are requesting additional funding. There is so much pressure on our fiscus as things stand now. And the key questions, therefore, are the ones raised on the slide, Comrade Chair, that the NDR is like a moving train. It stops in many stations for passengers to disembark and to get on board, and there are always possibilities of derailment due to many reasons, including faulty engines, bad drivers, and the like. Therefore, it's always important to remember this analogy. To recap, the objectives of the National Democratic Revolution were to achieve the freedom for the African majority and to socially and economically emancipate the oppressed masses. Currently, our country is polarized in terms of race relations, polling, the economy remains racialized and is stagnated with low investment. So to answer the question is that the NDR has been derailed. We, however, have opportunities to put the train back on trail and to pilot it correctly towards the attainment of the National Democratic Revolution objective. The biggest issue we must undertake is to review the unintended consequences of all our policy changes, Chairperson. I wish to thank the opportunity and thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Comrade Noxolo. I like your analogy of the moving train, which brings me now to the respondents. I'm sure Comrade Mike, Alex, and Umrabulo have heard the presentations from the three comrades. I'll start with Comrade Michael Sachs. I was reading your supplementary comment on the budget 2021, where you say that probably this budget's impact on the realization of the constitutionally entrenched socio-economic rights have not been considered. So maybe you might want to reflect on that amongst other things that you want to talk about today. Comrade Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Comrade Chair. Okay, I was going to say something slightly different, but now that you've reminded me of that, let me say that I think the discussion document of the ANC is a good summary of the context of what we've tried to do and what we've achieved and what we've not achieved over the last 25 years. And also sets out the challenges, which I think Niva has also spoken to, and the challenge of policy coordination in government in an unequal society, and concludes by trying to elucidate the elements of some kind of compromise between various actors in the South African economy. And I think all of that is very well put in the discussion document, so it's a very good basis for discussion. I think one weakness in the document is it doesn't address or place at the center of developments over the last 25 years, what I would call the fiscal state. And that is, when I say the fiscal state, you know, in the ANC, we're used to saying that we want a mixed economy. But what I think many of us don't realize is that all capitalist economies in the modern world are mixed economies. There's no such thing as a non-mixed economy. And as capitalism has developed over the last 200 years, one consistent element of that development is the increasing role of the state in taxation, the provision of services, and the redistribution of income. So even the most kind of market-friendly, others might say neoliberal state in the world, the United States, about 40% of their income as a country is managed by the state. So every economy, including the US, is a mixed economy. And South Africa, unlike many other developing countries, is quite unique in the developing world, that we also have a very large state which conducts very large operations in taxation, the redistribution of income, and the provision of core services that are required for capitalism to function effectively. So if we look back, and I think these things aren't covered sufficiently in the document, that's why I'm pointing them out. If we look back to over the last 25 years, Niva was talking about the commodity boom. So we've been unable to achieve a path of growth for ourselves that is not driven entirely by developments in the global economy. All the growth in South Africa and the changes in outlook over the last, of a big nature over the last 25 years have all been driven by global developments. So we had the commodity boom in the 2000s, from about 2000 to about 2010, 2012, somewhere around there. And during that period, from 2000, starting under the Mbeki administration, there was a very large extension of the state that occurred over four elements. One was as we're all familiar with, a large extension of social grants. The second was a very large expansion of the services, the core services that the state provides. And those services are in the criminal justice system, healthcare, and basic education. So those constitute the core of any modern state. And over this period from 2000 to about 2012, you saw a massive expansion of those sectors, both in terms of the number of people who are employed, the teachers, the nurses, the doctors, the police officers, the court clerks, and all of the other personnel that are needed, that they expanded in numbers. But secondly, we gave those public servants a huge increase in they made huge gains in their conditions of service and their real incomes over that period. Now, that was the right thing to do, no doubt about it, because we need those services. Oh, sorry, so there were 4 elements. The one is social grants. The second is the expansion of core services. The third is the improvement in the conditions of service in public servants, their remuneration. And the fourth was a very large infrastructure investment effort, extremely large. Unfortunately, while these things were in motion and while government was expanding its commitments, growth collapsed. Which is a lesson for us when we hear that people saying that, all we need to do is for government to spend more and there will be growth. Government was spending more and more and more up to 2012, and then growth collapsed, even as it was spending that money, because global conditions changed. And then again, we were unable to articulate as the ANC a path of growth out of this problem. So increasingly, that increase in the provision, in the state provision of those basic services, social grants, education, healthcare, etc., criminal justice, it increasingly became difficult to finance from taxation. And we began to rely more and more on borrowing. Now, I don't want to spend too long, but I just want to say that I think now we are facing an intensification of the growth crisis that we've had since 2012. Remember, South Africa's per capita income, in other words, its average income has been falling for 5 or 6 years. Unemployment has been rising significantly. In 2008, unemployment was about 25%. Now it's about 35%. So we've had a growing slowdown of economic growth and rise in unemployment, and public services are being under pressure. And in my view, the central issue in our inability to chart forward a path of growth have been fundamental political contradictions within the ANC. That is the single most important constraint on South Africa's expansion and development. It's not out there, it's within the ANC. And these contradictions and the inability of the leadership of the ANC to articulate a coherent program of growth and development and change. And I think even if I look at the inputs that have been made today, which I've been asked to respond to, I'm struggling to see a coherent program of growth and development and change. But now we have, so you'll hear people in the economic world talking about policy inconsistency. It's a very polite term and it sounds like a very small thing, but now I want to say that the policy inconsistency has reached crisis proportions, because we have now tabled a budget, and this goes back to what Comrade Jeff was asking at the beginning about, in my capacity as the chair of the FFC, the Finance and Fiscal Commission, we tabled a comment before Parliament saying, this budget that has been tabled, however we slice it, it means a significant, real erosion of the value of those public services that I've been talking about, of healthcare, public healthcare, basic education, and criminal justice, and of huge proportions over the next 3 years. And the sad truth is that even if we implement that budget, we will still not resolve the rise in debt that South Africa faces. We will still be increasingly indebting ourselves. And so there's now a fundamental policy inconsistency at the heart of government and at the heart of the ANC. And we saw it on the streets today, where we have the ANC and some saying our policy is to extend free basic education. The ANC and the government also saying there's not money for free basic education. We're going to see the same thing breaking out all over the next few years. It might not be this year, but the budget implies a contraction in the provision of services. And those services, by the way, those public services that I've been describing constitute a very large share of the income and consumption of the core constituency of the ANC, meaning the poor African masses, if I can put it like that. So on the one hand, we have a set of policy objectives that Comrade Enoch set out at the beginning around what we would like to see happening. National health insurance, free tertiary education. Some have spoken of free basic income grants. And so we have a policy framework of the ANC that envisages an expansion of government. But we have a fiscal framework that envisages a significant reduction in government. Now, I'm not saying that. My view is that there's no way we can get away from this without taking some pain somewhere in the system. And we will need to reduce government expenditure one way or another in the years ahead. But if we're not prepared to make explicit choices, if we're not prepared to make decisions that, comrades, we cannot afford this one because we've got our eyes on a different objective. If we can continue to act as though everybody can have everything they want, we will increasingly find ourselves presiding over a country of disappointment and disappointed people. And so I think we have to look into the ANC and ask whether it is able to take us forward. I want to just finish by showing you one slide. I think I've said a mouthful, so I won't try and add. Okay, apparently I can't show the slide. Is it possible, Rahmat, to have to enable my screen sharing?
Thanks, Comrade. Oh, you're able to show it?
Yeah, here we go. So this slide is showing projections of economic growth in 2022. And the reason I'm showing you the projection for 2022, which is in a few years' time, is because it kind of takes coronavirus and COVID out of the picture, and it says, what is the projection of growth once the pandemic has passed and countries have returned to a kind of normal rate of growth? And these are the projections of the IMF. I mean, everyone has their projections. It doesn't really matter. But the point I want to make here is that these are all of the projections that the IMF does. So I've not selected some countries. I've taken all of them. So this is all the major economies in the world. And if you look, I see Comrade Jeff squinting there. But South Africa, I can inform you that it's here far on the left of having the slowest growth of any economy in the world, really any major economy, at least. I don't know, maybe Syria has a slower growth rate, but or Venezuela, but now if you're in this position, it shows that, and of course, National Treasury's growth projection for 2022 isn't much different from its 1.6%, this is 1.4%. So there is no reason to believe at the moment from the policy framework we have that this will be altered. So people believe out there that South Africa's growth rate after coronavirus passes will be lower than its population growth rate, so that average income of South Africans will be falling. And this is very important to understand in the debate we have about macroeconomic policy, because people say, why don't you do quantitative easing, for instance, and I'm now provoking you more. I mean, India is doing it. You know, the Philippines is doing it. Indonesia is doing it. Poland is doing it. Why don't we also have an expansive macroeconomic approach to solve the problem? And of course, India can borrow as much as it wants. Nobody cares how much. Everyone wants to lend to India because India is a growing society. And so Indians will have more income next year and in 5 years and in 10 years than they have today. And if you know that somebody's income is growing, it's fine to lend them money. But if somebody is on a path of decline and deterioration, people start getting very jumpy about lending their money. So unless we alter this path that we're on, and I think the answer is, and I agree entirely about Neva, that it's about structural reform, but everyone has a different view of what structural reform is. But that's the only answer. And in the short term, unfortunately, in my view, and this is my concluding comment, which is intended to open the door to Comrade Alex, who's coming. In the short term, in my view, the only way we are going to accelerate economic growth in South Africa is if we put the private sector at the head of the effort to accelerate investment. And not through some, by giving them promises about the returns they will get on their investment. That is not a statement that the private sector is better or that we should love the private sector or something. It's just a recognition, in my view, that our back is against the wall now. And time is running out. And if we're unable to articulate a path ahead and make the compromises needed, we're going to be in a rough ride going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Comrade Mike, for those frank articulations of the views and assessment of this NGC discussion document. We really appreciate that. I think the issue of economic inconsistency, policy uncertainty is one of the key things that we need to resolve as the ANC, but also we're an ANC in alliance with other partners, such as the SACP, which is my next respondent, Comrade Alex, who represent the Polka vanguard of the working class. Comrade Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Comrade Jeff, and greetings to the other panelists and the 109 comrades who have connected to this platform. Let me also greet those who are on Facebook. Comrade Michael paved the way for me in a way that emphasizes contradictions and
which are a source of development.
Which are a source of development. And when he posed the challenge, I was too slow to craft a response. But if I may be allowed to start with that by sharing something on the screen, and then I will come to the document. I just quickly thought about it. If I may be allowed to just share something on the screen.
You may proceed, Comrade Alex.
Are you getting help? Oh, there it is.
Yeah, by the way, we are at the same institution. So, Comrade Jeff, we had a caucus how to approach this session. We are at the same institution, also at VETS, but I just thought quickly I should tap into some of my research work to share certain experiences, and in the process, this could contain some responses to the thesis being put forward here. I would like to start in the area of industrial policy, perhaps, yeah. Comrades, and let me also thank you for the multidisciplinary approach to this debate. This is quite different from the approach taken in the discussion document. The discussion document is more embedded in the market. So its indicators of progress are more market indicators. And I'm not saying those are not important, but I'm just saying they occupy the heart of the document. Having had Comrade Michael pose that challenge for me, I wished I should start with it. I took the industry I come from in the manufacturing sector. That is the automobile manufacturing industry. And the reason why I took it is because there is reference to that industry in the discussion document. And Comrade Neva made reference to that industry. And I wish to go into what the document does not do, which Marx, Carl, Comrade Jeff does in Capital, Volume 1. I think it is from chapter 6, where he goes into what he calls the hidden abode of production, where capital not only produces, but is also produced. And the reason why I have to emphasize this is that I will highlight that reason later, except for now to say that if we do not go into the hidden abode of production where capital not only produces, but is also produced, we will find great difficulties in explaining why we have the problems of inequality, because we are dealing with the system which is based on inequality. We are dealing with a capitalist system, and the key tenets of the capitalist system is inequality. So it is a system that is not designed to eradicate inequality because it is based on that system. If you remove inequality from the equation, the system will collapse. And let's just go into the hidden abode of production. And I would like to underline a particular change that is taking place there, technological change, which we cannot see perhaps in the market. I have the graph on the screen here. You will see in the automotive industry from 1995, we've got this massive growth, Comrade Michael, in the private sector. And I'm taking this automotive industry because it is the largest manufacturing sector in our economy. It is the largest exporter, as the document is saying. You will see here there has been massive capital expenditure, or what you will call investment. It collapsed here in 2006 because between 2006 and 2007, it was the global economic crisis, what the document calls the global financial crisis. It was not just the global financial crisis. From the theory of crisis, we know that most of the crises we experienced in history, including the Great Depression as a crisis, are first indicated in the market. And at a later stage, we know that they are followed by a production meltdown, high levels of unemployment, including fiscal crisis of state finances. So we are dealing with a much more broader crisis that the document refers to it as the financial crisis. So that is the first thing I will propose. The writers of the document need to relook at it and improve the theory of crisis there. Now, as a result of the crisis here, there was this massive collapse in investment up to 2009. Investment, Comrade Mike, came back in the private sector, and we are taking this private sector, the automotive industry that at least I know back, rose up to 8.2 billion rand in 2017. Let us now look at what happened in terms of employment. This investment is by 7 original equipment manufacturers. That is the assembly plant companies. Employment was falling, okay? So employment was very high here. As investment advances north, employment goes down south. However, we experienced a stable employment scenario in the automotive components manufacturing sector. I will come to this from a policy recommendation point of view, because that's where we have the potential of creating employment. And I will reflect on this from the master plans, because it is important to study each industry according to its dynamics. And when we come up with master plan, to respond according to our understanding of the dynamics there. When investment rose there, we saw productivity was rising, Comrade Mike, in the productive sector. And by 2014, from 1995, units per head were double what you had in 1995. However, the number of workers producing this vehicle had fallen by 10,000, 8,600 to be specific, by approximately 10,000 as that investment was rising. So it is important. It is very, very, very important that when we talk about investment, we do not look at it only from a market point of view. We look at it only also from the hidden abode of production, that is the workplace, where there are technological changes. Those of us who come from the workplace know about lean production system. This is the leading factory. Toyota is the leading global manufacturer in that particular regard. We saw here factories able to produce more cars with fewer workers. You can see here our domestic vehicle production was shooting up, while the number of workers involved in the assembly of these vehicles was shooting down. So this is just some piece of evidence, so that when we talk about this investment was important. And yes, this investment made the sector globally competitive. I must say, I'm one of the workers who worked in this sector. I was in engineering maintenance, where we were looking after automation and robotics. And those changes plus technical organization of production brought about the picture you see here. So from an industry point of view, this is the situation that we are experiencing. Although we are saying the sector is globally competitive, Comrade Niva, the reality is that the value of imported components in the vehicles produced in South Africa is higher than the value of components produced in South Africa, as this graph is showing. Lastly, because this was triggered by Comrade Mike, I wish to indicate something. We have been producing cars in South Africa. However, from a manufacturing value addition perspective of the vehicles we produce in South Africa, our manufacturing value addition 2013 was 36%. In other words, of the total car, of the value of the total car minus imported value, right? This is what we produced and exported. So it is very important, of course, to raise the levels of production in the industry. And one way in which we can raise the levels of production in the industry is to deepen and widen our manufacturing value addition. Because of technological change, what many of our leaders refer to as the fourth industrial revolution, combining particularly in this sector, automation and robotics, which I worked on as an artisan in engineering maintenance. it is possible to produce more output. From a GDP point of view, the value of your output can grow while the number of workers employed in producing it is heading down south. So the recommendation that I propose here before I get into the document is that in order to avoid that situation, we need to grow volumes in the sector. We must grow the automotive components manufacturing sector. We need very strong value addition at tiers 2 and tiers 3. I leave it there, Comrade Michael, because this was triggered by you. I just wanted to indicate that a general reference to private sector investment without an appreciation of the mechanics of how that investment works in relation to employment can generate expectations that might not be met. This is the sector we need to support, but we need to support it in a way that will generate employment. If we may remove the slide, if we may stop.
But also, Comrade Alex, another factor is that as a government, we pumped billions of rands in terms of incentives to support the automotive industry in our country.
I deliberately left that. I deliberately left that because often it is the money that government directs to the workers and the poor in the form of grants that is being attacked. From the Motor Industry Development Program, its successor, the Automotive Production Development Program.
I was not detracting you from
the Automotive Master Plan. We are talking about these finances. However, there are benefits we have derived from this because there have been changes in the South African economy, with South Africa earning foreign exchange from the export, but we can do better. We can move our manufacturing value addition from 37% to 60% and expand manufacturing in the sector to employ more workers. So that when we talk about private sector investment, we talk about a state that is able to direct it. In the discussion document, reference is to the production of private automobiles like motorbikes. India is one of the best producers in that particular sector. Perhaps there is something we can learn out of that, except the labor regime that is prevailing there, which is so not desirable in terms of our South African conditions. Having said this now, let me come to the alliance matters, and I will summarize them as follows.
Yeah,
One,
summarize them, Comrade.
Yes. One, it will be incorrect to generally conclude that the idea of radical economic transformation is populist. I suggest we should not do that. We know the roots of these ideas in 2012 when we spoke about the second transition, and the ANC policy conference gave it direction, resulting in the ANC adopting the strategic perspective of the second, more radical phase of our democratic transition or the national democratic revolution. In 2019, we put this idea into the manifesto. When the president outlines the way forward from COVID-19, he also made reference to this idea. Therefore, what we could perhaps say is that there are different articulations, and the weakness could be that the ANC did not give it content. Secondly, the document talks about mixed economy. Here, I would like to agree with Comrade Michael that all capitalist economies are mixed economies. However, the document moves us rightward. Michael emphasized the importance of the role of the state from fiscal policy point of view. I would like to emphasize the role of the state as a democratic developmental state that builds national production, because employment can come from national production. And by production here, I include circulation, which includes trade. We need a national democratic developmental state that does not withdraw, like our state currently is withdrawing from capital accumulation. When you look at the direction of the document, the major thrust is that of enabling capitalist capital accumulation and withdrawing the state from the process of capital accumulation with the intention of using the proceeds of that accumulation to look after the needs of the people. This is why the SACP had a serious problem with the economic policy reform. Those economic policy reforms, you can look for yourself, come from an OECD publication going for growth, economic policy reforms, they were taken as they were and presented to us as the way forward of the economy in the Republic of South Africa. That is why in the document where it deals with the balance of forces and contestations on policy, the document leaves outside contestations, not only within the ANC as Mike referred to it, but also within the alliance. Last year, we saw an agreement by the Alliance Political Council that we should work together to produce economic reconstruction and development. What happened is that the ANC ETC went to do so alone, and thereafter there was this road straight to Netlek, from Netlek to Parliament, of course, back to the ANC Luhutla. We still have not had that alliance process. That is part of how economic contestation takes place. The document refers to the state having taken a pro-cyclical policy stance. However, it is at pains to explain that that was not austerity. It nevertheless does not explain why the state chose the path of pro-cyclical rather than a counter-cyclical policy. Comrade Eno, there is no doubt that in fact, what you will call state investment strike or the withdrawal or the reduction of state participation. If you look at the overall budget up to 2024, up to the end of the current term of office of President Cyril Ramaphosa, things are going down from a fiscal perspective, and growth is also following. It is going down from 3.3 in terms of the projection to 1.6 of next year and further down. So in this term of office, the reality is that things will end up badly. And comrades, there are 4 objectives.
Concluding remarks, Comrade Alex.
Okay, thank you. There are 4 objectives which the document says it was written to do. One is to review the past 25 years of economic policies. I propose there must be further work in that regard. The document left out the period of GEAR and analysis of the consequences of GEAR and the substantive difference between GEAR and the RDP. The document correctly emphasizes some of the successes during that period, but it is shy to accept policy responsibility for the policy failures that have occurred. There is no way, for example, we can succeed to transform this economy by making microeconomic adjustments while leaving the macroeconomic framework under whose auspices we failed to overcome the crisis of unemployment, poverty, and inequality.
On that note,
the document says it should end with a program pointing forward to the next 25 years. That is missing in the document. The document theorizes immediate measures, but we cannot see the next 25 years in the document in terms of programmatic interventions, the way forward and the vision. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Alex, for that input. I'm glad that you did not refer to GEAR as the 96 class project, but that's a debate for another time. And last but not least, our respondent, Comrade Nqobile Nzimande, our youngster, a budding economist with a bright future. You have the floor, ma'am.
Thank you. Hello. Good evening. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me? Sorry.
Very well.
Firstly, I would like to say thank you. Thank you. I'd like to say thank you for this opportunity. And the discussions have been quite around the discussions that have been taking place right now. We're talking about transformation. We're talking about moving into a state that is one that brings about a revolutionary change and a difference. We're talking about a South Africa that actually incorporates its citizens within the economic transformation which we speak about. And as well as we've had the conversation around, as you're reading the document, it spoke about the fact that in manufacturing, finding jobs in certain sectors and actually looking at basic services and trying to figure out where within those basic services there has been movement since 1994 and where in those basic services we can find movement. And we do know that when we're moving into this new transition, into a new democratic state, We were sitting in a space where we were actually asking the question of fight or flight. What is going to happen to skills within South Africa? Right now, we're sitting in a space where we're actually sitting there and we have discussed situations around how jobs are a situation. We've discussed situations around how we need to start trying to figure out how it is that you create employment and all these other aspects. But my question now lies in that if we're talking about moving forward within these skills and with these with all these ideas that we have, with all these policies that are in place, my question then lies in looking forward in our discussions today, mentions of areas such as the green economy, mentions of areas such as what's actually happening in terms of our technological transition as well. And we might be able to look at, yes, we are probing at statistics and we are looking at statistics as well. But looking forward, I have been looking at the Global Social Mobility Index, and that was something that really brought a spark to realizing what is actually going on in South Africa in terms of our actual economy. The Global Social Mobility Index actually pointed out that we were 77th out of our resources and getting education.
You have unmuted. Can you unmute yourself?
Within the economy. The question lies in what can we now do? How do we now share our resources amongst people? Because we need to understand that economic growth is not something that takes place in isolation, but it is something that includes human welfare as well. It's something that includes the people. And it's something that needs to engage with that. So we have these policies, since we're speaking about GEA, we're speaking about the NDP, we're speaking about all sorts of policies that have been in place and now have been put there. And yes, we say South Africans in general, we're sitting in a space where there are quite a few South Africans where we're sitting, where we know that we have, for example, a growing class of new working citizens. We have a growing class of people coming into the employment sector, but it's very easy to jump out of that employment sector too. So the question is then, with talking about manufacturing, talking about these areas that you're moving into, how is it that we create an actual sustainable virtuous cycle, moving out of a vicious cycle? Because we've spoken about our GDP moving up and down since the beginning. Now we're stuck in a space like it's to bring out what is
You keep on breaking now.
I'm not educated generation, and I'm also sitting in a space where they too have a certain type of skill. So as much as we have grown in terms of, at least we know that from our history, we know that we can rely on our resources and we can rely on what we have in place and those sort of areas. But just listening to the conversations that I have heard coming from an actual younger perspective and from my understanding, is that in growing this economy, that business entrepreneurs areas, but in the documents, like onto the actual document, the document in itself does point out even the fact that they know in future we want to move into an actual space where we can actually say that we are now trying to create a package of how the future economy is actually going to look like, especially post-COVID, and trying to figure that out. And it might sound like it's ideas or things that are brought about that are in the clouds, but at this point in time, it's to look and to actually figure out in terms of our skills and actually connecting them to what's going on within the rest of society and what's going on in the rest of the world, because we do stand with policies such as our sustainable development goals. And we do know that we're trying to align our policies to that. So we do know our manufacturing industries and our footprints that we have in terms of actually doing that. We are heavily reliant on our actual resources, but also now looking forward, it's about figuring out how to actually now incorporate, because I feel like there are quite a few gaps that exist within our policies that are addressing our past issues that we have had, But moving forward now, when we're talking about by 2030, this is what we'd like to achieve. This is what we'd like to achieve in terms of future actual movements. The question is now, where in these policies is there evidence of us actually moving forward? We are a small, open, developing economy. We are developing, and we might not be ahead of others. And it's just to see how it is now, where if we measure our social mobility, and this links into our economy, because we know that with our economy and economic growth, there is opportunity for South Africans to rise up through that economic growth. Social mobility index, one thing that it did point out is that for someone who is of a lower class citizen within South Africa, out in a low income family, it will take about 9 generations for you to reach the median income family. Whilst in your more Nordic countries, such as Sweden and Norway, they say that there, it actually takes about 2 to 4 years to actually climb up. So with us looking at our policies, instead of just like we write, the policies are there, they're in place, they're existent, but actually measuring the actual impact of those policies and how to actually shorten that gap so that we can meet up with our fellow competitors, our other developing countries and our actual foreign countries is what we stand with. And I do stand on the points, and I do agree with the point that was points that were raised about a mixed economy within South Africa. We're trying to move out of the capitalist space, trying to move into more socialist, into communist policy. Trade, but sitting at an actual stop where we're going to ask that to adjust, because moving from where we are now, moving through this COVID space and where we are sitting, it's a new dawn, it's a new era, it's a new time for us to actually start to think about what our policies have done in the past 25 years and what our policies can do in a new world, a completely new world where we can adapt and adjust as an economy too. So with that being said, that is my contribution to this discussion. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Umrabulo. That brings us to the end in terms of presentations. Now, I know that we're running out of time, but I would like Comrade JP to assist me because I was not looking at the comments or the questions. JP, how are we doing in terms of the comments and the questions?
Comrade Jeff, I would appeal that maybe we take a few questions. We seem to have a bit of a technical difficulty on my side here, just to access all of these questions properly.
I don't see any hands on my screen. So can you try? Okay, I have here Comrade Qinisani Dumagute and Comrade Givin and Comrade Senzani in that order. If you can be quick because we're running out of time, comrades. Qinisani, you have the floor. Qinisani is not there. Comrade Givin. He's not there either.
Pungani, can you hear me?
Hello, Comrade Chair.
Pungani, can you hear me?
Is that Qinisani?
It is Qinisani Pungani, yes.
Yeah,
good
we are on
evening
the
to
floor.
You.
Can you quickly
Yes,
raise your comment?
Pungani, good evening to you and to all the participants. I just have a central issue. Number one, I think energy is the propeller for any growing economy. So I'm of two minds. We need to expedite the completion of the Medupe and Kusile power stations, remove the red tape about other energy players coming onto the scene. By doing that, we stabilize an already constrained electricity grid, which will enable manufacturing and allow the economy to grow. So I think we need to reassess and relook our energy policies, who's allowed to participate and who's not allowed to participate. Because without energy, nothing happens. I remember on one show, Bruce Whitfield once said, our biggest enemy is Eskom. So we need to get that sorted out. With that sorted out, everything else will have a domino effect. That's my contribution for this year.
Thank you, Comrade Qinisani. Comrade Givin, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Comrade Chair. Just a brief contribution also. I've listened to the speakers and the respondents. My one very brief contribution is that, and I'm aligning myself largely with what Comrade Alex Mashilo, Dr. Alex Mashilo said, that while, for instance, Comrade Michael Sachs indicated the importance of private investment in our economy as a country.
Can you speak to the mic so that you can hear?
All right. Can you hear me properly now?
Yes.
Yes. I'm saying, while I agree with Comrade Michael Sachs with regard to private investment in our economy as a country, however, I agree with Dr. Alex Mashilo when he says we can't allow private investment or continue without a state regulation. And I'm saying this in the context of what the Economic Transformation and Policy Discussion document says, that when we're negotiating this transition for, in the early 90s up until 1994, the Ready to Govern document indicates that we allowed, we didn't want to tamper with the transformation of property relations, with the hope and assumption that private business was going to spontaneously and voluntarily work with the democratic transition in transforming property relations so that then the wealth and capital gaps can be transformed, so that therefore we're dealing with the poverty, unemployment, and inequality. However, the very same economic transformation policy document going to the NGC confirms that unfortunately business failed to come to the party with regard to dealing with the social contradictions that remain persistent and very stubborn in the landscape of our economy. And my final conclusion, therefore, Chair, is that in light or in the context of that, we need indeed invite private investment in our economy. However, the state must play its role through a number of progressive policy interventions, such as progressive labor market policies, which are going to defend worker salaries, for instance, including the progressive worker conditions in the working place, so that then indeed we don't allow business to continue undermining the labor rights of the labor force across the economic landscape of our country.
Thank you, Comrade.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Then Comrade Senzeni.
Thanks,
Comrade Senzeni.
Comrade Jeff. Oh, what's happening now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, yes. Thanks, Comrade Jeff. Let me also welcome the input. But on the lighter note, I thought that Comrade Mashilo will be able to comprehend the issues that are happening with China as a mixed economy and able to give us a perspective, because we tend to learn there. Three things, Comrade Jeff. I listened to all the speakers. None of the speakers spoke about the issue of corruption. And that contributes almost about 12 to 18% of our GDP from the state. So I really don't know the same, I mean, resources that we don't have, nobody able to speak sharply about that. The second issue that is very key to me and very important is the re-engineering of the BE. Because of the BE, it's a good policy that's supposed to be able to advance both the development and also bring a majority that they were excluded in a mainstream economy for them to be able to do it. The discussion document and also the presenters now, they are not speaking at large of how that, the BE is being abused in a broader space of things. I'll give you an example, Comrade Jeff. We know as a matter of fact that there are many people who wants to do the triple P with the states, invest the money in the economy. But for those triple P to able to advance or move on, it depends that who knows who, where, how do you know that particular individual without able to take those particular issues into consideration, simply because of our red tape and a bureaucratism that is there in a state is still allow the same apartheid mental, a posture of how do you able to open up the market for Black people to able to come in there. I'm not of the view that there's no enough resources. The resources are there, but how do you able to do? The last issue that I want to speak about, none of the presenters also spoke about the illicit cash flow, of which that is where also most of our resources are being siphoned out of the country without able to benefit us. Maybe if we can able to give more emphasis and focus, particularly in the mining industry, that how best way do we deal with issues of illicit cash flow. Not only there, including in the agriculture now is growing at a high speed, including also in a green economy, including also in the ocean economy. The illicit flow is growing at a large space. And if we can able to resolve those particular contradictions, I think that the growth that we are anticipating of 3%, 3.5%, it can be even much better when we able to make it a point that everybody else can able to participate without any backlog or the level of corruption that is subjecting our people
thanks,
to.
Thanks, Comrade. Thanks. I have the last two ones because we're running out of time. It will be Comrade Kifense and Comrade Jerry, and that will be the end, so that I can allow the panelists and the respondents to make their concluding remarks. Comrade Kifense. Are you there?
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very
Can you unmute yourself?
Can you hear me? I think
yes.
Yes, I was saying thank you so much for this progressive session. One has really learned a lot here, but I just have two issues. One is in context with the African Free Trade Area Agreement, to say, as South Africa, have we identified the policy framework and the infrastructure that is key to position us to take full advantage of the economic opportunities that this agreement presents, and also to participate meaningfully, especially in the SADC region. And if we are to identify these things, furthermore, have we identified our trade advantages, the comparative advantages and absolute advantages we have in what we produce and what we want to trade with other countries? And if we're to do this, I think it should feature in the industrial policy that we are attempting to solidify and consolidate. And the last issue is on the issue of immigrants, to say, are we able to quantify in real sense, in the real sense, the impact that the influx of immigrants has had on our progress or our lack, therefore, in achieving the objectives of the National Democratic Revolution? For example, one presenter spoke about cheap labor when he was contextualizing the economy inherited from apartheid. And I can tell you for a fact that currently the same issue is happening, where companies are employing immigrants so that they can pay them less. And in doing this, they also abscond the responsibility of paying the minimum wage, by the way, which then becomes a problem. So are we able to quantify the impact and what the hospitality, tourism industry and logistics industry? Because if we don't resolve this issue and we're not able to quantify the adverse impact this thing has had on us achieving these objectives, then whatever else we do will not have the desired net effect that we want. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comrade. The last person to make a comment is Comrade Jerry Tivedi. Comrade Jerry.
Thank you very much, Comrade Jeff. Can you hear me?
Yes, definitely.
I've got just a brief point to make because my other points about corruption has been made. So the point I want to make really is that everything points to economic decline. And economic decline definitely will lead to unemployment. But I don't hear the issue of retraining and reskilling of unemployed workers coming into the picture here, because the people who are going to be affected are actually people who are voters of the ANC who are going to be losing their jobs. And the people who are going to benefit are few people who are not necessarily supporters or voters of the ANC. So in the long run, if we don't take care of making sure that we retrain and reskill those who are unemployed, I don't think they will have confidence in the ANC and they'll vote for the ANC in the coming future. It is a political question, but I think it's very much important because it must be at the center. And that retraining and reskilling, the state must have an interest to have an agenda to know exactly where these people are and how are they being taken care of by the economy. Because if you push them out and you don't take care of them, definitely we are taking them out even of the ANC. I think we must keep that in mind. Thank you, Comrade Jeff.
Thank you, Comrade Jerry. Thanks for all those comrades who have made comments and questions. I would like to ask the respondents first, Ngobile, Alex, Mike, to respond, and then we'll get to Notolo, Niva, and last with Comrade Enoch. In that order, Comrade Ngobile, you each have 2 minutes to respond.
Hello, thank you for those points. I was very intrigued with the last point as well that brought about the question of finding out what it is that is going to help those who are unemployed, those who are your voters, and those who do sit in seats where they want to find out where is the future of the country leading. So I think that in policies and agendas that are being drawn out and written out and discussed right now, the inclusion of your ordinary citizens needs to take place as well in terms of discussing the economy. And discussing the economy is very based on unskilled workers, very based on the space of actually trying to figure out how to move people out of the poverty gap. And moving people out of the poverty gap is something that is going to require thoughts around not just looking at the inequalities that we are currently trying to move towards. So thank you on that point.
Thank you. Comrade Alex.
Thank you, Chair. I wish to thank the drafters of the paper. They opened an important debate. As a discussion document, it cannot just be born with perfection. It is from engagement such as—
Can you speak to the mic?
Can you hear me, Chair?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, I said I wish to thank the drafters of the paper, the ANC, ETC, and the ANC for developing this paper. As a discussion paper, it cannot be born perfect. Perfection comes from sessions such as this one. By the time we get to the National Policy Conference, I am sure the paper would have been enriched. And in that regard, I wish to propose that the paper should be rephrased and be geared towards achieving the ANC strategic objective of advancing, deepening, and defending a second radical phase of our democratic transition, so that everything we say in the paper, we can judge it from that strategic perspective, with the Freedom Charter defining our destination. We must be able to say, this is how the things we say in the paper are connected with the aims of the Freedom Charter. And another contribution to the paper, it talks about inequality, but it does not deal with wealth inequality the way it deals with income inequality. There is a book in which Judge Dennis Levis participated. That book shows that in South Africa, wealth inequality is much higher than income inequality. It is almost close to 1% by Gini coefficient. So the question is, how do we empower the masses of the people so that they too have wealth, to avoid a situation where we drive economic transformation through structural reforms? By the way, the SACP advances the notion of radical structural economic transformation, not the OECD and the IMF notion of structural reform. So we are still committed to a transformation path. So we propose in that way, we should ask the question to what would happen in South Africa for us to empower the masses who have got no stake in the wealth of this country, so that we do not pursue elite politics. So that we do not pursue the politics of empowering a few individuals on the basis that they are Black, while the millions of Black people live in poverty and are exploited, live in hunger, and are just going nowhere and will end up withdrawing their support from the ANC because of the serious pressures on the ground. We must not get there.
Thank you, Comrade Alex. Comrade Mike.
Thank you, Comrade Chair, and thanks for my fellow panelists, especially Comrade Mobile, who managed to inject a note of optimism, which we all need. I would say, just in response to some of the other comments, that I think capitalism is like a bicycle. If it's moving forward, you can go somewhere. But if the wheels stop turning, you will fall. There's no way you can maintain your balance. You will collapse. And the thing that turns the wheels of capitalism is private capital accumulation. That is that is the engine of capitalism that drives growth. So if that is not operating, it's very difficult to achieve any upward movement in incomes. And I think this is really the issue, that we need to restore the upward momentum of national income. It's true that investment might not lead to jobs, and those questions should certainly be addressed. And of course, unemployment is the central question. But right now, we're riding a bicycle that is not moving. And the immediate issue is not the strategic objective or the vision for 25 years, is how we get that bicycle to move again. And I think one of the audience members proposed or suggested that at the center of it could be energy. And I would agree with that. But where I would disagree is that they then says we must complete Medupi and Kusile. That the truth is that government has not succeeded in delivering those huge, massive infrastructure projects. And we need to, and given the crisis we face now, in my view, we need to open that energy sector to private investment and get this bicycle moving again. And only once the bicycle is moving, then we can discuss what is the destination that we're aiming for. But if we don't get the momentum going, it's going to be difficult to achieve anything. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Mike. Comrade Nokolo.
Thank you, Comrade Chair. Let me appreciate the comments and the questions from the comrades and the various presenters. In fact, one does want to agree with some of the issues that, especially from the comments from the floor on energy, that we cannot go anywhere without energy. So he's emphasizing the point we really have raised. We therefore must ensure that we drive that the changes there in a vigorous way. Secondly, Chair, we have not spoken on corruption, which also has an impact on the economy. Probably, Chair, it becomes difficult to, in 10 minutes, say everything that is being done in government. But some you leave out with the understanding that everybody knows that as a country, we've stabilized our justice system to ensure that prosecution in cases of corruption is dealt with in a manner that kind of stops people from continuing with such. My last point, Chair, is on the immigrants. The Department of Home Affairs is currently busy with releasing a list of skills that we can allow people to migrate into the country for, that we can attract. And that is intended to ensure that we limit those who would come when without the necessary skills that we need as a country. But besides that, that is to try and ensure that we normalize our environment, because we already have pressure where people, the citizens, are complaining quite largely on this. And therefore, yes, we understand the impact. Maybe we must then say to Comrade Mtsoaledi, let him also publicize that kind of information. But the skilling is there, Chair, throughout our programs in every sector. Skilling and reskilling is the program of government, and we will drive it vigorously. I want to thank once more the opportunity and appreciate the rich contributions from everyone. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Comrade Nokolo. Comrade Niva. Comrade Niva. Comrade Niva, are you there? Looks like Comrade Niva is not there. Comrade Enoch. Comrade Enoch.
Is happening? Oh, is it?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Recall that whenever we launched in years without a COVID, we launched the NGC papers or policy conference papers. We launched it for comments by the general public as well. And I think this is my interaction is achieving that objective. I want to suggest that comrades who have not found time to articulate their ideas efficiently can also utilize, make the submissions and address them to Nogwanda's email. Having said that, Comrade Mashiko and I share an interesting background. We are both from NUMSA. NUMSA then is characterized by different tenders and different disagreements. And we hardly agree on anything else, but I can say today there's at least a convergence on the automobile sector and the component set. He will recall that as early as 1991, a discussion in NUMSA ensued. I want to contextualize what he said about the future of the automobile industry and the future of components. At the time, most of the automobile OEs were manufacturing different models of cars and therefore undermining components. It is in that spirit that we agreed that in order for that industry to create more jobs, they must have single manufacturing, which can ensure that there's scale of economies for components. And that slide shows exactly the benefit of that active industrial policy. I would agree with the comrades who are talking about energy. Energy is the backbone. But I must say, out of 13 years of dealing with trying to fix ESCOM, I've become disillusioned and began to focus more on new capacity by different players. And I think that's more what we should be emphasizing. There are a whole range of issues that have been raised, including corruption. I mean, the resources that are going now to bail out state-owned enterprises, we should be doing other things, are a product of the cost of corruption in this economy. And I think comrades have raised the African trade. I mean, Africa is becoming our major trade partner at the moment, and in a faster pace. In agriculture, for instance, now they've become number one of our consumption for agricultural export, taking 30%, 38% of agricultural export. So Africa is critical for us, but I'm saying these comments, Comrade Chair, we appreciate them, and comrades are encouraged to comment, write, and do anything so that we should incorporate those in the run-up to NGC and policy conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comrade Enoch. Is Comrade Neva back on being unmuted?
Yes, I am. Thank you. Sorry, I kept saying post.
Your concluding remarks?
Yeah, concluding remarks. Oh, so, you know, I just want to say in terms of what Michael and Alex were saying, the way I read the discussion document is not to say business is the only thing, but that where we have been not so successful is in managing capital. So I would disagree with Michael that it's just about giving capital what they want. The point is that when they are able to reproduce, as Michael says, yes, that's important and accumulate, but they have to do it in ways that support society, and the job of the state in that context, but particularly in our context, is to ensure that they maximize their profits when they actually benefit society and not otherwise. So when, for instance, Kumba and Anglo American capture the rents from iron ore, that is not in the interest of society, and we should be doing something about it. So I think part of that is knowing what we want. Part of that is understanding what they need and what they want. Part of that is being clear about what our power is and their power. And part of that is also just communicating clearly and not giving in immediately or holding out when the cost is higher than the benefit. So I think this issue of managing capital is critical for economic policy in a capitalist society. And we shouldn't pretend that it's not. That where the economy is different from, say, education or health is that most of the people who work in it don't work for us. So we have to manage it. And then the only other thing I wanted to say was, well, two things. One is that I entirely agree about the politics of this, that we have been since 1994 saying to people, be patient and we will deliver, and we haven't delivered, and you can't blame them if they start losing patience and think about voting for other people. And I think that is critical for a political party or a liberation movement to think about, are we accountable to our constituency? Are we delivering to them? And not just, how do we stop big business from declaring a strike? We need to get that balance right. And finally, I do think, you know, we do have to talk about what happens when the state ignores that mandate. So the budget really does cut basic services and then cut taxes on the rich in real terms. And I think that that's not a path that is sustainable in this country. You know, if you have a highly unequal democracy, you can't just ignore the issues around redistribution. So I think that, you know, we need to say what happens when we have a priority of at least providing relief for the poorest of the poor, and that doesn't happen through the budget. How do we talk about that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me take this opportunity of thanking all the distinguished panelists and the respondents, as well as all those comrade supporters who participated in this NGC discussion document on the National Democratic Revolution. My take home here is that let's make sure that this National Democratic Revolution's train is always on track, that we continue to oil its wheels, ensuring that all the faults are mended so that we can be able to reach that national democratic society. All the inputs, as Comrade Enoch has highlighted, will be incorporated in order to improve the document as we go along. We're going to continue in these platforms and other platforms from the branches, regions, provinces, and national to ensure that this critical part of South Africa, the economy, is at the heart of our approach to bring about economic certainty going forward. With those remarks, thank you very much. We'll meet again in the next discussion documents. Cheers.